Alright, buckle up, because we're diving headfirst into the Roman Empire. This wasn't just some civilization. It was a hyper-efficient machine obsessed with infrastructure. Think highways before Google Maps, aqueducts way before indoor plumbing was a thing, and a bureaucracy so complex it makes modern email look like child's play. The Romans were so focused on getting things done that they conquered half the known world, largely, to improve water pressure. So, before you settle in, hit that like button and subscribe if you're digging what I do here. Also, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always cool to see where everyone's tuning in from across the globe. Now, Rome didn't exactly spring into existence as this mind-blowing civilization. Nope, it started as a swamp, basically a glorified campsite where shepherds yelled at each other across a river. But somehow, those same mud-covered people built an empire so advanced that we're still impressed and a little suspicious 2,000 years later. At its peak, Rome was massive, stretching across continents, ruling the oceans, and inventing bureaucracy just to keep track of how awesome it was. They could supply fresh water to millions, get rid of their waste, and then schedule a gladiator fight for entertainment. Seriously, no empire before or since has managed to make indoor plumbing and public slaughter seem equally appealing. The key to Rome's success wasn't some divine intervention or dumb luck. It was a deadly combo of discipline, paperwork, and relentless competence. Roman engineers weren't sitting around dreaming about flying or pondering philosophical questions. They were obsessed with drainage systems. These were the kind of people who looked at a swamp and thought, "Let's build a city here. It'll be hilarious." They had no electricity, no power tools, and definitely no YouTube tutorials. All they had was geometry, a ton of slaves, and sheer, unadulterated determination. And against all odds, it worked. Their cities had heated floors, functioning sewage systems, and running water. At a time when most of Europe still thought rain was some kind of witchcraft, Rome's genius was all about control. If nature wasn't cooperating, they forced it to submit. Mountains were tunneled through, rivers were redirected, and deserts were crossed just to prove a point. When they said all roads lead to Rome, they meant it literally because they built every single one of them. But Rome's real superpower wasn't just concrete or aqueducts. It was pure, unadulterated pride. The empire was fueled by confidence. Every building was a flex, every invention an insult to anyone still using sticks. Even their ruins seemed smug, those arches standing tall after earthquakes, practically whispering, "Still up, aren't you?" And the best part? They did all of this without electricity, computers, or even a shred of humility. Rome didn't invent everything, they just made everything better, bigger, and preferably with columns. If you want to know why Rome lasted so long, don't focus on its legions, its laws, or its gods. Check out its concrete. Because while empires crumble, Roman cement just refuses to quit. The Romans didn't invent concrete, they just took the idea, mixed in some volcanic ash, and created something practically indestructible. They called it opus cementitium, which roughly translates to, "We figured this out before you did." The formula used lime, ash, and seawater to create a material that actually heals itself over time. Modern scientists only rediscovered this property a few years ago, proving that humanity peaked around 120 BCE and has been winging it ever since. This mix allowed the Romans to build entire temples, bridges, and harbors that are still standing strong today. The Pantheon, the world's largest unreinforced concrete dome, hasn't budged in 2,000 years. Meanwhile, modern buildings collapse if you look at them too hard. It wasn't just durable, it was also artistic. Romans treated concrete like magic clay. They molded it into arches, domes, and vaults so elegant that future architects spent centuries trying, and failing, to copy them. They didn't hide their engineering behind walls. They showed it off. The message was simple. We could crush you, but we'd rather impress you. They used it everywhere. Aqueducts, amphitheaters, baths, even harbors submerged underwater. The Portus Cosenus, built with Roman marine concrete, still survives beneath the waves. Modern divers go down to study it, and you can almost hear the ancient engineers laughing. Of course, not everyone was impressed. Greek purists sneered at the rough texture and called it ugly. But the Romans didn't care. They were too busy reshaping the world. Concrete wasn't art, it was power you could build with. And that's the beauty of Roman innovation. They didn't just build monuments, they built permanence. The empire fell, the emperors vanished, but their walls refused to. In the end, the real mystery isn't how Roman concrete worked, it's how the rest of us forgot. 2,000 years later, we're still pouring weaker cement, building uglier structures, and calling it progress. The Romans would have called it incompetence. If Roman concrete was the muscle of the empire, aqueducts were the veins, carrying life, luxury, and the occasional dead rat straight into the heart of civilization. Before Rome, most cities got their water from rivers or wells, a charming but pretty unhygienic system that often led to dysentery. The Romans looked at that and said, "No thanks." Instead, they built over 260 miles of gravity-powered waterways that delivered fresh water to over 1 million people. No pumps, no motors, just math, arrogance, and perfect angles. Each aqueduct was a masterpiece of precision. Engineers calculated gradients so subtle that water could flow for 50 miles without spilling a drop. They tunneled through mountains, built stone arches across valleys, and made sure the water arrived with just enough pressure to make a public fountain dramatically unnecessary but morally satisfying. And yes, they used lead pipes, which might explain why later emperors thought marrying horses or declaring themselves gods was a brilliant idea. But toxicity aside, the system worked flawlessly. Water flowed through homes, bathhouses, gardens, and entire fountains built purely to say, "We're cleaner than you." Rome had over 11 aqueducts, each named with the same level of pomp as a luxury brand: Aqua Marcia, Aqua Claudia, Aqua Virgo, the Evian of antiquity. The Aqua Appia, their first, was built in 312 BCE and still functions today. Meanwhile, some modern cities can't keep a water main running for 5 years without issuing an apology on the local news. At its peak, the aqueducts delivered 200 million gallons of water per day, enough to fill 300 Olympic swimming pools if Rome had cared about sports that didn't end in bloodshed. Public baths stayed open all day. Fountains gushed for aesthetic dominance, and even the poorest citizen could enjoy a rinse that didn't involve a muddy puddle. For the Romans, plumbing wasn't a luxury, it was civilization. They believed running water separated humans from animals. Ironically, most of Europe would forget that belief for the next 1,000 years. Rome didn't just master water, it mastered convenience. And that, more than any conquest or battle, is why its empire still resonates today. Because nobody remembers the general who won a war, but everyone remembers the people who built the plumbing. If there's one thing the Romans couldn't stand, it was filth, or at least other people's filth. Their cities were loud, crowded, and full of questionable street food, but somehow they were also clean. Rome managed to do what most medieval cities never did: figure out how to handle human waste without letting it take over. The heart of this genius was the Cloaca Maxima, one of the world's first sewer systems. Built around the 6th century BCE, it started as a drainage canal and evolved into a subterranean labyrinth that still carries water today, which is impressive if you ignore the kind of water it's carrying. The Cloaca Maxima collected runoff from streets, bathhouses, and latrines, funneling everything into the Tiber River, where, in true Roman fashion, someone was probably still fishing. It wasn't perfect, but it kept the city from drowning in its own civilization. The medieval world wouldn't rediscover this concept for about 1,000 years, choosing instead to throw waste out windows and hope for a strong breeze. Romans were fanatical about public hygiene. They had public baths in every city, enormous complexes with heated pools, steam rooms, and gymnasiums. Everyone from senators to slaves could bathe daily, gossip, and debate politics while sitting naked in a room full of steam and ambition. Even the toilets were communal, long marble benches with holes, no stalls, and a shared sponge on a stick. It wasn't glamorous, but it was efficient. The Romans didn't fear germs because they didn't know what germs were. Yet somehow they still managed to live cleaner than most 14th century kings. And here's the kicker: they turned sanitation into propaganda. Aqueducts, sewers, and baths weren't just civic utilities. They were proof of moral superiority. Cleanliness meant civilization, Dirt meant barbarism. When Romans looked at conquered territories, they didn't just see enemies. They saw people who still used buckets. In short, Rome was the first society to realize that infrastructure is image. The empire ran on two things: water pressure and pride. And while the emperors may have been insane, at least their cities smelled better than history usually does. If Roman concrete was the skeleton and aqueducts were the veins, then their roads were the arteries. And Rome had a lot of blood to pump. The empire built over 250,000 miles of roads stretching from the sands of Egypt to the fog of Britain. That's enough to circle the earth 10 times, which, knowing the Romans, they probably would have tried just to prove a point. These weren't just lazy dirt paths either. Roman roads were military-grade infrastructure layered with gravel, stone, and the crushed bones of anyone who complained about the workload. Engineers planned every slope and curve with mathematical precision because a Roman hated nothing more than inefficiency, except maybe the Gauls. They didn't just build roads to travel, they built them to control. Roads moved armies, taxes, and gossip at terrifying speed. A message could travel from Gaul to Rome in a matter of days, assuming the messenger didn't get mugged, which statistically he did, but still faster than any rival civilization by centuries. Every milestone along the road marked Roman dominance, carved with exact distances and emperor-approved smugness. The famous Via Appia, called the Queen of Roads, was so perfectly paved that even 2,000 years later, you can still walk on it, though it mostly hosts confused tourists and stray cats. Each road was built to last. They layered it. Large stones for the base, gravel for the middle, and smooth paving blocks for the top, tilted slightly for drainage. The result? Roads that survived empires, earthquakes, and European weather, the true test of endurance. Modern highways, by comparison, need repairs every other election cycle. Meanwhile, the Via Flaminia still casually exists, looking down at us from eternity like, "You call that asphalt?" But Rome's roads weren't just practical. They were psychological warfare. Every straight, perfect line said, "You are part of Rome now. Try rebelling. We'll be there by Tuesday." And honestly, that's what made the Roman Empire unstoppable. Not the legions, not the emperors, but the logistics. Because while everyone else was fighting mud, Rome was fighting time and winning. If the roads were Rome's arteries, then its courier system was the empire's Wi-Fi. Fast, reliable, and occasionally intercepted by barbarians. Rome knew that an empire wasn't conquered by swords, it was maintained by communication. Orders had to move faster than rebellions. So, they built the Cursus Publicus, a state-run postal service created by Augustus, who apparently wanted to read bad news faster. This was no casual mail system. It was a logistical masterpiece, complete with stations, horses, and bureaucrats who probably slept in spreadsheets. Couriers carried wax tablets, scrolls, and imperial decrees across thousands of miles, changing horses at way stations called mutations. The rich could send messages across the empire in mere days, which was great unless those messages were tax bills. Each courier wore an official badge, the ancient equivalent of a government email signature. They rode day and night, swapping horses at every stop. Their only real hazards being exhaustion, robbery, or accidentally delivering a death sentence to the wrong villa. The system's efficiency bordered on terrifying. The emperor could send a command from Rome to Egypt in less than a week. Rebels barely had time to declare independence before receiving a polite note reminding them they were, in fact, still property. And because Rome loved control, they built maps, intricate scroll-like road charts showing every route, town, and way station. The most famous, the Tabula Peutingeriana, looks like a cosmic spaghetti diagram of the known world. It's basically Google Maps for people in sandals. But this wasn't a public service. Ordinary Romans didn't get to mail love letters or grandma sandals across the empire. The Cursus Publicus was for official business only, military orders, tax records, and the emperor's daily micromanagement. If you were a civilian, your best bet was handing your message to a friend and hoping they didn't die en route. Still, for its time, it was miraculous. Rome had built the world's first high-speed information network, powered by horses and human endurance. Messages crossed continents, empires stayed in sync, and history's largest bureaucracy kept humming. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. And in Rome, that was the highest form of beauty. Roman architecture wasn't just functional, it was propaganda carved in stone. Every dome, column, and arch screamed, "We are better than you, and we can prove it mathematically." The Romans didn't build small. They built monuments, the kind of public works that made conquered nations forget they were conquered, at least until the tax bill arrived. Their buildings weren't just shelters, they were statements. The Colosseum, for example, could seat over 50,000 people, had retractable awnings, elevators powered by slaves, and better crowd control than modern concerts. All this so people could watch tigers eat accountants. Then there was the Pantheon, which looks like the gods themselves designed it on a good day. Its concrete dome remains the largest unreinforced dome in the world because, apparently, rebar was for cowards. The oculus at the top, that perfect circular hole, wasn't just an architectural feature. It was a flex. Light streamed through it like divine approval, illuminating the empire's greatest achievement, its own ego. Roman architects didn't just master symmetry, they weaponized it. They used arches and vaults not only for strength but for beauty. Arches made aqueducts possible, bridges eternal, and temples impervious to time. They didn't decorate their structures with art. They made the structure itself the art. And let's talk about scale. Romans loved making you feel small. Entering a basilica or bathhouse wasn't relaxing, it was humbling. The buildings dwarfed everyone, reminding citizens that Rome was infinite, and they were, statistically speaking, not. Even the floor mosaics were designed to look up at you with quiet judgment. Everything in Roman architecture was perfectly balanced between utility and showmanship. The engineering was flawless, but so was the marketing. Every structure said, "We built this for you, but also to make you feel unworthy." And perhaps that's the genius of it all. The Romans built not just to last, but to outlast, to remind the future that while empires fall, smug architecture doesn't. Today, tourists line up to admire ruins that refuse to die. While somewhere deep in the dust, you can almost hear an ancient architect whisper, "You're welcome." Rome's greatest innovation wasn't the sword or even concrete. It was geometry with attitude. The arch turned the impossible into architecture. Before Rome, everyone built flat things. Flat walls, flat ceilings, flat roofs that collapsed the moment Zeus sneezed. Then came the Romans, who looked at gravity and said, "No." The Roman arch redistributed weight so perfectly that it let them build aqueducts, bridges, and stadiums that refused to fall down, even when empires did. Every curve, every keystone, every brick whispered a kind of smug mathematical poetry. The arch didn't just hold the structure, it held the empire together. And then there were the vaults, arches in series. When one arch wasn't enough, the Romans cloned it across a ceiling and called it a day. The barrel vault, the groin vault, the cross vault, all elegant names for what was essentially ancient structural flexing. They used them in baths, temples, and basilicas not because they needed to, but because they could. The Colosseum alone contains 240 arches stacked in tiers like an engineering wedding cake. Every arch perfectly balanced tension and compression, distributing weight down to the foundations. Modern architects still study it and secretly cry. But Rome didn't stop at physics. It made arches beautiful. You couldn't walk 10 feet in a Roman city without passing one named after a guy who probably didn't deserve it. Triumphal arches were the empire's version of a press release. We won something. Here's a giant reminder. The Arch of Titus, for instance, celebrates the destruction of Jerusalem in glorious stonework. Nothing says, "Please admire our empire," like immortalizing someone else's tragedy in marble. And that's the thing. The Romans didn't just master gravity, they humiliated it. Their architecture wasn't about surviving nature, it was about outsmarting it in public with style. 2,000 years later, their arches still stand, unbothered, while glass skyscrapers crack under the first mild earthquake. The Romans may have fallen to politics, plague, and bad leadership, but their geometry is still undefeated. The Romans didn't just build with water, they worked it. Where other civilizations saw rivers as scenic hazards, Rome saw a power source that never needed lunch breaks. They turned flowing water into labor, And in true Roman style, they did it on an industrial scale. The empire's engineers developed water mills, hydraulic saws, and grain factories that could feed entire cities. At places like the Barbegal Mill Complex in southern France, 16 massive water wheels worked in perfect harmony, the ancient equivalent of a food processing plant, minus the health code violations. It's often called the world's first industrial site, which is both impressive and slightly depressing if you've ever waited for your toaster to break down. Their ingenuity didn't stop at grain. They built hydraulic-powered stone saws for cutting marble, water-lifting devices for irrigation, and mechanical pumps to drain mines. If you think Roman engineer sounds dull, remember these people were moving entire rivers just to make bread faster. And yes, it was all powered by gravity, the quiet, invisible slave that kept the empire running. No electricity, no fossil fuels, no sustainability initiative, just pure, ruthless practicality. Water went in one way, power came out the other. Simple, beautiful, and completely terrifying in scale. Their hydraulic mastery even reached into entertainment. The Colosseum had an underground system capable of flooding the arena for mock naval battles because apparently, watching real ships sink inside a sports venue was the ancient version of special effects. Thousands of gallons of water in and out on command, all for spectacle. What's remarkable is how much of it still works. The ruins of Barbegal still whisper with the outlines of channels and sluices, like the ghosts of engineers who never clocked out. 2,000 years later, we still can't decide whether the Romans were geniuses or maniacs. But one thing's clear. They built an empire not just on conquest, but on motion. Water flowed, gears turned, cities fed, and history quietly admitted defeat. Rome didn't just control nature, it employed it, and it never even had to give it a day off. The Romans didn't just conquer the world. They wanted to live comfortably while doing it. After all, what's the point of empire if your marble villa feels like a refrigerator? Enter the hypocaust, Rome's version of central heating, invented 2 millennia before anyone else thought to complain about drafts. The system was simple genius. A furnace beneath the floor, channels that carried hot air through hollow bricks, and flues that vented it through the walls. The result? Heated floors, warm baths, and smug satisfaction. Rich Romans could stroll barefoot in January while northern barbarians were still defrosting by firelight. Public bathhouses ran on the same principle, but on an industrial scale. The baths of Caracalla, for example, could host thousands of people at once, each enjoying perfectly regulated heat in massive vaulted halls. Beneath it all, hundreds of slaves shoveled wood into roaring furnaces. Efficiency, Roman style. Luxury for the few, cardio for the many. Even their plumbing was advanced. Hot, cold, and tepid water flowed through pipes and fountains, making Roman spas the envy of the world, and occasionally a death trap when the lead content got a little too ambitious. Still, no one could argue with the comfort, and they didn't stop at heating. Wealthy Romans even experimented with cooling systems. They stored snow from mountains in insulated pits, then used it to chill wine or air out their dining rooms. In other words, the first form of air conditioning, powered entirely by slaves with bad backs and good endurance. Rome's obsession with comfort bordered on the divine. Every villa, bath, and palace was a temple to convenience. Heat, water, light. All harnessed for pleasure, all beautifully wasteful. The empire might have been brutal, but it was never cold. So, while medieval Europe later struggled to survive winter with fireplaces and prayers, Rome had already perfected the art of living like the world belonged to it. Because for a while it did. In the end, the Romans didn't just master warmth, they mastered control over air, over water, over comfort itself, and somehow over everyone else's expectations. Roman builders didn't have machines, engines, or forklifts. They had ropes, pulleys, and men with terrifying upper body strength. Yet somehow, they managed to hoist multi-ton stones into the sky with a precision that would make modern construction crews cry. Their secret weapon was the treadwheel crane, a massive wooden wheel big enough for 2 men to walk inside like human hamsters with a death wish. As they trudged forward, the wheel turned, the rope wound, and the block rose. It was simple physics, powered entirely by sweat, physics, and misplaced confidence. These cranes could lift several tons. And Rome didn't stop there. They stacked pulleys, added gears, and multiplied force until they could raise columns taller than most modern buildings. The Colosseum, the Forum, the Pantheon. None of them would exist without the relentless creak of these machines and the exhausted sighs of the people inside them. And of course, the Romans did it all without safety standards. No helmets, no harnesses, no days without accident posters. If something went wrong, gravity made sure it was final. Yet somehow the work got done flawlessly. Roman engineers treated mechanical advantage like divine revelation. They didn't just build cranes, they built systems. Construction sites were symphonies of levers, capstans, hoists, and shouting. They even used counterweights, an idea so smart it wouldn't become standard again until the Renaissance, when someone finally went, "Wait, didn't the Romans already do this?" The sheer organization was astonishing. Cranes assembled, cranes lifted columns, buildings practically built themselves. If by themselves, you mean hundreds of unpaid laborers being yelled at by an architect in sandals. The technology spread across the empire. Every port, bridge, and basilica owed its existence to these machines. They weren't glamorous like aqueducts or marble statues, but they made those things possible. In a way, Rome didn't just conquer the world, it lifted it one stone at a time. And when you stand in front of the Colosseum today, staring at its impossible height, remember this. It was built by people without cranes that beeped, hydraulics that hummed, or unions that complained. Just rope, math, and a little bit of madness. If Rome was the muscle of the ancient world, Alexandria was the brain, and sometimes the lab for weird experiments no one asked for. Under Roman rule, this city of scholars, inventors, and egomaniacs produced machines so bizarre and, ahead of their time, they still sound like bad science fiction. The star of this mechanical circus was Hero of Alexandria, a mathematician, engineer, and certified overachiever. Hero wasn't satisfied with simple levers or pulleys. He craved something more magical. His inventions included automatic temple doors, self-filling wine cups, singing birds, and even a coin-operated vending machine that dispensed holy water. Yes, 2,000 years ago, you could insert a coin and get divinely hydrated. Proof that capitalism and religion have always gotten along just fine. But his masterpiece was the Yalopile, the world's first steam engine. It was a hollow metal sphere that spun as steam escaped through its nozzles. Completely useless but spectacular to look at. The device powered precisely nothing, which is exactly why it was so beloved. It existed purely to make people go, "Wow!" and then move on with their day. Much like modern tech conferences, the Romans were impressed but not inspired. They saw Hero's spinning globe and thought, "Cute, but can it build an aqueduct?" Couldn't. So, the steam engine was shelved for the next 1,700 years, humanity's longest procrastination. Still, Alexandria was the ancient world's innovation hub. Automata, water organs, hydraulic clocks, all emerged from its fever dream of intellect and ego. Temples that opened their doors with fire, statues that moved by air pressure, fountains that sang the line between science and sorcery got so blurry that people started praying to engineers. Hero and his peers didn't invent machines to solve problems. They invented them because they could. It wasn't about practicality. It was performance art. And that's what made Alexandria remarkable. While Rome built for eternity, Alexandria built for wonder. One gave us concrete and sewers, the other gave us the first coin machine and an early prototype of, "Wow, look what I made." If Rome conquered the world with discipline, Alexandria conquered imagination. And for a brief, glittering moment, both empires met in genius. The Romans weren't initially seafarers. They were land lovers with good sandals. But once they realized half the Mediterranean was inconveniently water, they did what Romans always did. They copied someone else and then improved upon it until it terrified everyone. By the late Republic, Rome had built one of the most formidable navies in history. Their ships weren't elegant like Greek triremes. They were floating battering rams made of timber, bronze, and aggression, and naturally, they industrialized their construction. The Carthaginians once mocked Roman sailors for being amateurs. So Rome captured one of their ships, reverse-engineered it, and built a fleet of 120 in 2 months. Nothing says learning curve like weaponized plagiarism. The real innovation was the corvus, a boarding bridge with a massive iron spike at the end. When it slammed into an enemy ship, Roman soldiers could storm across and turn naval battles into ground combat, their preferred environment for stabbing things. It was brilliant if slightly suicidal. Many ships capsized from the extra weight, but hey, strategy has never been about safety. Their shipyards turned warfare into an assembly line. Dozens of galleys launched every week, each powered by hundreds of rowers whose dreams mostly involved being somewhere else. Some vessels were even equipped with rotating ballistae, enormous crossbows that could fire flaming bolts across the waves. Imagine being a sailor and realizing your job description includes flammable target. And then came the harbors, concrete structures that cured underwater. Roman engineers mixed volcanic ash and seawater to create marine concrete that defied erosion. 2,000 years later, many of those ports still exist, mocking modern coastal cities that crumble after a decade of weather damage. The navy itself became the empire's highway system. It moved legions, goods, and gossip faster than any caravan. When Rome called the Mediterranean Mare Nostrum, our sea, it wasn't arrogance, it was accounting. The Romans didn't love the ocean, but they mastered it. Their fleets didn't explore, they enforced. Every wave carried the empire's echo, every port its flag. They didn't just conquer land, they conquered logistics. And in the ancient world, that was far scarier than sharks. For all their love of blood sports and questionable wine, the Romans took medicine surprisingly seriously. They might not have understood germs, but they did understand that sharp tools and confidence could solve almost anything. Roman doctors, or medici, were part healer, part improviser, and part gambler. Most learned their trade from Greek physicians, whom Rome imported along with olives, philosophy, and other things it pretended to invent. The result was a medical system that was half genius, half barbarism, and entirely experimental. They had scalpels, bone saws, forceps, and even catheters, all made of bronze or iron, and designed to make you question your life choices. Archaeologists have found surgical kits in Pompeii that wouldn't look out of place in a modern hospital, except these came without anesthesia or malpractice insurance. Surgery was usually performed in public, which at least saved on theater tickets. And yet, some treatments worked astonishingly well. Roman physicians used opium for pain relief, vinegar for sterilization, and honey as an antiseptic. They performed amputations, set broken bones, and even carried out cataract surgery using long bronze needles, proof that bravery and stupidity are sometimes indistinguishable. Public health was another Roman obsession. They built hospitals, enforced sanitation, and actually cared about clean water, concepts Europe promptly forgot after the empire fell. Soldiers were treated in valetudinaria, the world's first organized military hospitals. Imagine a legionary walking in with a javelin wound and walking out only mildly infected. That's progress. Everyday life was just as efficient. Romans used soap made from animal fat and ashes, brushed their teeth with crushed shells, and wore cosmetic creams that could double as sunscreen or poison, depending on the recipe. Their obsession with cleanliness bordered on divine. Baths were ritual, not luxury. Hygiene as religion. Of course, not everything was perfect. If your condition confused a doctor, he might recommend prayers to Aesculapius or applying pigeon dung to the wound. Science and superstition shared the same bed uncomfortably. Still, for a civilization that fell 1,500 years before germ theory, Rome was doing shockingly well. Their medicine wasn't always gentle, but it worked occasionally, heroically, and almost never hygienically. Every empire eventually runs out of momentum or money or sanity, and Rome managed to run out of all three at once. By the 5th century, the greatest engineers on Earth were patching aqueducts while barbarians tore them down. The empire that once built the world's best plumbing was now knee-deep in metaphorical and occasionally literal sewage. It didn't happen overnight. Maintenance slowed, roads crumbled, and marble baths grew cold. The aqueducts that once carried water now carried rats. People began using the Colosseum as a convenient quarry because who wouldn't want a free archway for their farmhouse? The Pantheon stayed standing, mostly because nobody could figure out how it worked. Concrete, that miracle of chemistry, was forgotten for nearly 1,000 years. Medieval builders tried to recreate it and instead produced something that crumbled faster than their kingdoms. Plumbing disappeared, cities shrank, and Europe returned to its natural state. Muddy, cold, and blaming witches for bad weather. Rome's knowledge didn't vanish completely. It just went on vacation. Scrolls gathered dust in monasteries while the monks used the margins to draw dragons. Engineers became legends, and legends turned into miracles. People stopped asking how things worked and started assuming God handled it. And yet, even in ruin, Rome refused to fully die. Its aqueducts still stood like stone skeletons across the hills. Its roads cut through forests that had forgotten who paved them, and its ruins whispered in the rain. You had one job. Eventually, centuries later, humanity rediscovered what the Romans already knew: how to build straight lines, move water, and survive winter without divine intervention. Renaissance scholars dusted off the old manuscripts and realized with quiet despair that the ancients had done it all first and better. Rome's downfall wasn't ignorance. It was complacency. It built a world so perfect that future generations thought perfection was permanent. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. Still, the legacy endures. Every arch, every dome, every bridge that dares to stand for more than a decade owes something to that empire of engineers. Rome fell, yes, but its ideas refused to, because true genius doesn't crumble. It just takes a 2,000-year coffee break. In the roaring heart of Constantinople, a city that never slept, always schemed, and constantly judged, a girl named Theodora first learned what survival meant. Born around the year 500 CE to a bearkeeper at the Hippodrome, her early life was anything but royal. Her father's job involved entertaining the masses with half-tamed beasts, and when he died, the family's fragile security died with him. Her mother, left with 3 daughters and no prospects, did what many desperate Byzantine women had to do. She turned to the theater. But let's be clear, the theater of Constantinople wasn't some elegant hall filled with polite applause and intellectual debate. It was the empire's beating underbelly, a mixture of comedy, dance, satire, and seduction. The performers were adored and despised in equal measure. Men came to watch, laugh, and gossip while pretending they weren't enthralled by the women who ruled the stage. Theodora entered this world as a child, small, sharp-tongued, and already learning that beauty alone was never enough. She danced, mimed, and acted in plays that mocked the powerful and titillated the crowds. Some called her a courtesan before she even reached her teens. Others called her a genius of performance. What everyone agreed on was that she had presence. When Theodora walked into a room, the air changed. Even her enemies noticed. Her routines were scandalous by the standards of her time, involving bold gestures and biting humor aimed at the elite. She mocked politicians and priests with the same smirk she used on lovers. Yet beneath the glitter and laughter, she saw the cruel divide between the powerful and the powerless. Theodora may have been forced to entertain the upper class, but she never forgot that she wasn't one of them. By her late teens, she was infamous across the empire, praised for her beauty, condemned for her audacity. Aristocrats mocked her in public and sought her in private. She lived in a world where women were ornaments, yet she somehow managed to turn mockery into magnetism. The girl from the stage wasn't just performing anymore. She was rehearsing for power, and soon all of Constantinople would know her name. Fame is a fickle friend, and in Theodora's Constantinople, it could turn on you overnight. After a series of messy affairs and rumors that could have filled an entire scroll of gossip, Theodora found herself falling from favor. One powerful man she'd crossed, likely an official or wealthy patron she'd mocked a bit too cleverly, made sure the doors of the theater closed to her. So, with little choice and less money, Theodora left the glittering capital behind and set out for the provinces. Her exile began in Alexandria, the intellectual furnace of the Eastern world. It was a city of contrasts. Monks debating theology in one corner, dancers performing in the next, and street preachers shouting about sin above the noise of traders. Here, stripped of her stage and fame, Theodora faced herself. The woman once adored for her beauty was now alone, surviving on wit and scraps. Yet what could have broken others only sharpened her mind. In Alexandria, she encountered a Christian sect known for its severe teachings, possibly the Monophysites, who believed Christ had a single divine nature. Their message of endurance and humility struck her deeply. Theodora, the scandalous performer, began to reflect on redemption. Not the meek kind whispered in prayer, but a fierce, self-forged rebirth. She started weaving spirituality into ambition, learning that both could serve her survival. She also learned something even more valuable. Influence isn't just earned on the stage, it's commanded through conviction. Whether in the theater or the church, people followed those who spoke with certainty, and Theodora, always a performer, knew how to turn certainty into art. Eventually, she left Alexandria behind, traveling through the deserts of North Africa and Syria, accompanying a wealthy official for a time before parting ways. It was a period of trial and transformation. The gossip columns of Constantinople would later claim this was her shameful wandering. They couldn't have been more wrong. This was her metamorphosis, the cocoon from which the empress would emerge. By the time Theodora returned to the empire's heart, she wasn't the same dancer who had once performed for coins and applause. She was something far more dangerous. A woman who had seen the world, learned its hypocrisies, and decided she would never again be at its mercy. When Theodora returned to Constantinople, she carried no gold, no title, and no family name to shield her, only a quiet fire that unnerved anyone who looked too long. The city hadn't changed much. The same gilded mosaics, the same whispers of sin and sanctity echoing through its marble streets, but she had changed. The once provocative performer was now composed, reflective, and shrewd. She had learned that true power was not in the applause of the crowd, but in the attention of the few who ruled them, and soon one man in particular would give her that attention: Justinian. At the time, Justinian was not yet emperor. He was the brilliant nephew of Emperor Justin I, ambitious, disciplined, and socially awkward in that charming way powerful men often are before history romanticizes them. He was a man obsessed with order, law, and destiny, but also one with a curious weakness. He admired strong minds as much as beautiful faces. Theodora somehow managed to embody both. Legend says Justinian first saw her while she was living modestly in a small house, spinning wool and offering counsel to other women. She was no longer the spectacle of the hippodrome. She was a mystery wrapped in humility, but when she spoke, her words had the precision of a knife. Justinian was captivated not by her beauty, which remained undeniable, but by her intellect. She understood people, politics, and the subtle art of making men think they'd thought of something first. Their connection was immediate but scandalous. Byzantine high society sneered. Marrying an ex-actress was unthinkable. Actresses were legally barred from such unions, yet Justinian wasn't the kind of man to let laws stand in his way. He rewrote them quite literally. A special decree lifted the restriction, allowing him to marry Theodora. It was an unprecedented act of defiance, one that shook the moralists of Constantinople to their perfumed core. When they wed around 525 CE, tongues wagged across the empire. The emperor's nephew has married a courtesan, they said, but the laughter of the courtiers died quickly. For the first time in history, a woman once jeered from the stage was now walking the marble halls of power, not as a mistress, but as a partner, and the empire had no idea what was coming next. In 527 CE, the empire trembled as Emperor Justin, old and ailing, officially crowned his nephew Justinian as co-emperor, and at his side, dressed not in silk from the stage, but in imperial purple, stood Theodora. For every senator who clenched his jaw and muttered prayers of disgust, there were 10,000 citizens in the streets staring, whispering, and wondering how a woman born to a bearkeeper had climbed to the highest throne in the East. Her coronation wasn't just a political act. It was a public declaration that the empire's old rules were being rewritten. Theodora wasn't there by accident or affection. She had earned her place. In every conversation, she matched Justinian's intellect. In every council, she outmaneuvered nobles who underestimated her. When foreign envoys bowed, they weren't sure whether to address her as Augusta or Your Majesty. Theodora made sure they learned both. She quickly became more than a ceremonial consort. While Justinian obsessed over law codes, aqueducts, and tax reforms, Theodora studied people, the real machinery of empire. She read letters from provincial governors, met with church leaders, and even heard petitions from women who had no voice in court. To many, she was a symbol of possibility. To others, a dangerous precedent. A former entertainer wielding imperial authority. It unsettled men who had built their careers on pedigree, not ability. Her influence soon became undeniable. She advised Justinian on everything from diplomacy to domestic reforms, particularly in issues affecting women. Under her counsel, laws were passed protecting women from forced prostitution and granting greater property rights. Theodora, once labeled the empire's shame, had become its unexpected moral reformer, but her power came at a cost. The aristocrats loathed her. Monks whispered that she was Jezebel reborn. Chroniclers like Procopius wrote scandalous secret histories claiming she still possessed the soul of a seductress. Yet the woman they mocked behind closed doors was the same one standing beside the most powerful man in the world. Calm, composed, and untouchable. By the time Justinian officially ascended as sole emperor later that year, Theodora was not merely his empress. She was his equal, the sharp mind behind the golden throne. The streets that once echoed with her laughter now echoed with her legend. It began, as revolutions often do, with entertainment gone wrong. In January of 532 CE, the Hippodrome, the same arena where Theodora's father had once kept bears, and she herself had danced, erupted in fury. The rival chariot teams, the Blues and the Greens, had long been more than sports fans. They were political factions with deep loyalties. That day, their chants turned from cheers to war cries. What began as a protest against arrests escalated into 6 days of bloodshed, fire, and rebellion. The infamous Nika Revolt. Byzantium burned. Senators eager to restore their lost influence secretly sided with the rioters. The mob, tens of thousands strong, roared for Justinian's overthrow and the crowning of a new emperor. The palace shook with the sound of rage outside its walls, and inside the imperial council descended into panic. Advisors begged Justinian to flee, to abandon the capital, the throne, and his dignity, but not Theodora. Dressed in purple, the color of royalty and blood, she refused to run. She rose before the council, her voice steady amid chaos. "If flight were the only means of safety," she said, "yet I should disdain to fly. Those who have worn the crown should never survive its loss. Purple makes a fine shroud." It was more than courage. It was strategy. Her words snapped Justinian out of hesitation. The emperor, who had nearly fled, regained his resolve. He ordered his generals Belisarius and Mundus to storm the Hippodrome. The result was a massacre. 30,000 rebels slaughtered in a single afternoon. The rebellion ended not with diplomacy, but with the echo of swords and the stench of smoke. Theodora's defiance saved the empire that day. Her speech became legendary, taught in every future history of Byzantium, but beyond the rhetoric, it revealed the true nature of her power. She wasn't just Justinian's emotional anchor. She was the spine of the regime. After the revolt, no one dared question her authority again. The courtiers who once whispered behind fans now bowed deeply. The mob that once cheered her downfall had been silenced in their graves. Theodora had proven in the most brutal way possible that she was not a survivor of scandal, but the architect of survival itself. When the smoke of the Nika revolt finally cleared, Theodora emerged from the ashes, not merely as empress, but as something rarer, a ruler forged in fire. Constantinople lay wounded, its streets charred, its people broken, and its faith in leadership shaken. Yet out of that ruin, Theodora saw opportunity. Justinian rebuilt the city in marble and stone. Theodora rebuilt its conscience. She had never forgotten what it meant to live at the mercy of men, as a performer, as a woman, as someone dismissed before she even spoke. Now that she had power, she used it ruthlessly in the service of those who had none. She pushed through reforms that no emperor before had dared to consider. Women forced into prostitution were granted protection and refuge. Slavery of the desperate was restricted. Husbands who abandoned their wives could be punished. Women could inherit property in their own right. To the elite, these were shocking policies. Soft, they sneered, unfit for empire. But Theodora didn't care about the senators who grumbled over their wine. She cared about the women who came to her palace gates at dawn, seeking justice. She established a house called the Metanoia, Repentance, a refuge for former prostitutes where they could live, work, and start anew. It wasn't charity. It was vengeance disguised as mercy. Theodora had turned the empire's shame into its strength. Her moral authority, however, was double-edged. Many of her critics called her reforms hypocrisy, citing her scandalous youth. They missed the point entirely. Theodora's power came because she had lived the life the empire condemned and survived it. Her empathy wasn't theoretical. It was lived experience wrapped in silk. Even Justinian, the great codifier of law, deferred to her insight on social matters. When he revised the empire's legal code, Theodora's influence could be seen in the new protections for women and the poor. Her fingerprints were embedded in the very laws that shaped Byzantine society for centuries. Yet for all her compassion, she was no saint. Theodora's mercy had limits, and her enemies learned that the hard way. For every woman she lifted up, there was a nobleman brought low, often without realizing until it was far too late that the empress had already written his fate. Power in Byzantium was a performance, and no one understood the stage better than Theodora. But with every bow from a general and every polite smile from a senator came a hidden dagger. The court of Constantinople was a nest of ambition, and Theodora was the brightest, most envied serpent within it. Her rise had humiliated the aristocracy. Noble women who traced their bloodlines to Rome could hardly stomach a former actress commanding their husband's respect. Some pretended loyalty. Others whispered poison in corridors heavy with incense. Monks thundered from the pulpit that the empress was the devil in silk. Chroniclers like Procopius, her most spiteful critic, recorded her as a scheming seductress who used her body as others used the sword. In truth, she was guilty only of doing what every man in that palace did, but better. Her intelligence and sharp tongue made her both admired and feared. She was known to humiliate courtiers with a single glance, to freeze a senator mid-sentence with one raised eyebrow. When Justinian faltered in judgment, Theodora made the hard decisions, especially the ones that required no mercy. She played politics like chess, and her opponents never realized they'd been cornered until the board was swept clean. Her rivalry with the general Belisarius's wife, Antonina, was both alliance and war. The two women ruled their husbands as power partners, then turned on each other in bursts of betrayal and reconciliation that made even the gossips exhausted. One day, they'd share secrets over wine. The next, one would be orchestrating the other's downfall. It was court life at its purest, friendship laced with arsenic. Still, Theodora's sharpest weapon wasn't fear, but loyalty. Those who served her faithfully were rewarded beyond measure. She raised servants to courtiers, courtiers to governors, women to saints in the eyes of the empire. She built her own network of spies, informants, and loyal clerks, a silent army that answered to no one but her. Behind the jeweled veil, she was always calculating, always watching. Theodora had learned the first rule of power early. Survival depends not on innocence, but on control. And though her enemies, enveloped in gold and silk, she alone understood that crowns weren't inherited. They were defended through relentless, sometimes brutal, decisions. If politics was Theodora's battlefield, then religion was her chessboard. The Byzantine Empire wasn't just a state. It was a divine hierarchy, a system of power dressed in imperial robes. However, beneath the shimmering gold leaf mosaics and the swirling clouds of incense, the empire was deeply divided by theological conflict. The question that was tearing the Christian world apart seemed deceptively simple. Was Christ of one nature or two? To outsiders, it seemed like mere hair-splitting theology. But to Byzantium, it was a cause worth fighting a civil war over. Justinian, ever the legalist, staunchly supported the orthodox position that Christ possessed both a human and divine nature. Theodora, on the other hand, quietly but firmly championed the Monophysites, who believed that Christ's nature was singular and divine. This wasn't just a matter of belief, it was about loyalty. The Monophysites had sheltered her during her exile in Alexandria, and now she was returning the favor by sheltering them. While Justinian was busy debating with bishops, Theodora was playing her own intricate game. She transformed sections of the palace into safe havens for persecuted clergy, secretly smuggling exiled monks back into the city and hosting clandestine councils right under the emperor's very nose. In public, she'd smile and nod politely during Orthodox ceremonies. But in private, she'd send golden letters of support to Monophysite leaders who were hiding in deserts and monasteries. To some, this was sheer hypocrisy. To others, it was clever diplomacy. But to Theodora, it was simply justice. Her maneuvering wasn't purely religious. It was also strategically brilliant. By backing this marginalized sect, she was effectively balancing her husband's authority with her own independent network of allies. While Justinian might have ruled the empire's laws, Theodora ruled its souls. She understood something that her husband never fully grasped: that faith could control the masses far more effectively than any decree ever could. However, her actions also served to deepen the chasm between them. Justinian adored her, but their differing faiths became quiet rivals. He firmly believed that unity could be found in doctrine, while she believed it lay in mercy and compassion. And even though they ruled side by side, they often seemed like two separate empires existing within one. His was made of marble, while hers was built on conviction. Her defiance left a lasting impact. While the Orthodox chroniclers cursed her name for centuries, the Monophysites remembered her as a saint, their secret empress. Even years later, they whispered her story in remote monasteries, calling her the protector of the true faith. In an age where belief could literally get you killed, Theodora had done the unthinkable. She turned heresy into power and compassion into an empire. By the mid-540s, Constantinople had undergone a dramatic transformation, and so had Theodora. The massive reconstruction that followed the Nika Revolt had turned the city into a dazzling jewel of the world, crowned by the Hagia Sophia, its vast dome floating like heaven's canopy above the skyline. But behind all the splendor, plague and exhaustion were creeping through the empire. Justinian's constant wars were draining its coffers. Disease swept through the capital, and the once vibrant empress began to fade. Theodora had been many things in her life: a dancer, an exile, a queen, and a reformer, but she had never been fragile. Still, by 548 CE, illness began to tighten its grip on her. Historians suspect cancer, although the truth is buried with her. Even as her body weakened, her will remained as strong as iron. She continued to hold court from her bed, issuing commands through loyal attendants, scolding ministers, and refusing any show of pity. She had lived too long, surrounded by weakness, to show any herself. Her final months were marked by an eerie sense of serenity. The woman who had once defied riots and theologians alike spent her last days surrounded by the empire she had reshaped. Justinian, broken with grief, visited her daily. To him, she was so much more than just an empress. She had been his shield, his counselor, and his equal. Without her, even the laws he had written seemed lifeless and empty. He had once rebuilt Constantinople from ashes, but he couldn't rebuild Theodora. When she finally died at the age of about 48, the city fell silent. The very same streets that had once mocked her name now wept openly. The woman who had danced barefoot in taverns was laid to rest in imperial robes of purple and gold. Justinian had her buried in the Church of the Holy Apostles, the traditional resting place of emperors, an honor that very few women had ever earned. But Theodora's death wasn't an ending. Her legacy lived on in every law that protected the poor, in every woman who dared to speak her mind, and in every stone of the Hagia Sophia that glittered beneath the sun. She had risen from the filth of the theater to the glory of the throne, wielding beauty, intellect, and audacity like divine weapons. Centuries later, historians still debate whether she was a saint or a sinner. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between, in the incredible story of a woman who refused to be forgotten. Before they became the iron-fisted rulers of the Baltic, The Teutonic Knights were simply a group of German pilgrims with a tent. It was the year 1190, and the siege of Acre was grinding the Third Crusade into the dust. The stench of blood and disease hung heavy in the air. The Holy Land had become a furnace of faith and death. In the midst of all this chaos, a small group of men from Bremen and Lübeck, German merchants turned crusaders, set up a makeshift hospital beneath white sails stitched together from their ships. Their goal wasn't conquest, but simple compassion, to care for their wounded countrymen who had fallen under the burning sun. That humble act would be the spark that lit a much darker fire. What started as a band of healers soon grew into something far more formidable. War has a way of transforming charity into necessity, and necessity into power. Within a decade, these German brothers, once devoted to tending the sick, had taken up arms to defend their hospital. Their compassion hardened into discipline, their faith sharpened into zeal. By 1198, the transformation was complete. With the blessing of Pope Innocent III, the Order of Brothers of the German Hospital of St. Mary in Jerusalem was officially declared a military order, a fusion of monk and soldier. They wore white mantles marked with a stark black cross, a symbol of purity wrapped in menace. Their vows were holy: poverty, chastity, and obedience. But their purpose had become unmistakably martial. They modeled themselves after the Knights Templar and the Hospitallers, but with one crucial difference: they were German. Their language, their organization, and their rigid hierarchy reflected the cold precision of the Holy Roman Empire. They were crusaders with a bureaucratic soul, knights who could pray, fight, and file reports with equal discipline. The order's early years were spent defending Christian pilgrims and fortresses in the Holy Land, but Jerusalem was slipping away. The crusading dream was dying in the desert, and the Teutonic Knights knew it. To survive, they would need a new frontier, a new Holy Land to conquer. Soon, their eyes would turn away from the sands of Palestine to the frozen forests of the Baltic. There, amid pagans and snow, their real empire would begin. Discipline was the very marrow of the Teutonic Order. To join, one had to abandon not only worldly possessions, but also one's individual identity. Upon entry, knights surrendered their names, their families, and any hint of personal ambition. In return, they gained a white cloak marked with a black cross, the unmistakable symbol of God's soldiers from the north. Their motto, though never officially written down, could have been simply, fight, serve, obey. Life within the order was monastic, rigid, and severe. Each knight took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, ideals that often sounded holier on parchment than they looked in actual practice. Poverty meant living without personal wealth, even though the order itself grew incredibly rich from land and spoils. Chastity meant avoiding women, but the frontier was long, the winters were even longer, and temptation lingered in every pagan village. Obedience, however, was absolute. A knight who questioned his commander didn't face debate. He faced expulsion or the sword. The ranks within the order were sharply divided. At the very top stood the Grand Master, a combination of general, priest, and bureaucrat, followed by commanders, priests, and lay brothers who handled all the logistics, farming, and trade. Even among warriors of noble birth, humility was strictly enforced. A baron might be scrubbing dishes right next to a peasant-born squire, and both would eat the same plain meals in total silence. Arrogance was considered the devil's whisper, and the Teutonic Knights prided themselves on being deaf to it. Their castles weren't just fortresses. They were also temples of order. Within their thick stone walls, daily life followed a strict rhythm of prayer, training, and combat readiness. Bells marked the hours of devotion, and every single action was considered a service to God, from sharpening swords to cleaning armor. Warfare was just another holy routine. But beneath this disciplined surface lay a deep contradiction. The order's members believed themselves to be both monks and conquerors, men of God wielding steel in his name. They preached humility while erecting castles that towered over Baltic tribes. They vowed purity while baptizing entire regions with fire and blood. In their minds, conquest wasn't greed. It was salvation delivered at the point of a sword. This was the paradox at the very heart of the Teutonic Code. absolute faith fused with absolute control. In their relentless pursuit of divine order, the knights had created something more enduring and far more dangerous than they even realized. A holy army that answered to no one but itself. By the early 13th century, the Holy Land was slipping from Christian hands, and the Teutonic Knights knew it. The grand castles of Jerusalem were falling one by one, and the crusading zeal that had once ignited Europe was cooling rapidly. But the Church had a new idea. If the pagans of the East wouldn't come to Christ willingly, then Christ would come to them by the sword, if necessary. The Baltic region, still home to the Prussians, Lithuanians, and Livonians, tribes who worshipped forests, fire, and the old gods, became the next holy battlefield. It was Duke Conrad of Masovia, a Polish ruler constantly tormented by raids from the pagan Prussians, who first extended the invitation. In 1226, he offered the Teutonic Order land along his northern border, a modest region called Kulmerland, in exchange for protection and conversion of the pagans. For the knights, it was the perfect offer: a divine mission, political backing, and a vast wilderness to tame. Pope Honorius III and Emperor Frederick II both sanctioned the expedition. The Teutonic Knights were granted the land they conquered in perpetuity, answering only to the Pope. It was a political loophole so cunning, it might have made the devil himself smile. By 1230, the order had arrived, their white cloaks flashing against the dark forests of Prussia. The natives didn't exactly welcome them with open arms. They fought fiercely, striking from the trees with ambushes and fire arrows. The Teutonic response was methodical and merciless, the slow, relentless grind of discipline against defiance. Villages were razed, idols were smashed, and temples were burned. Pagans who resisted baptism were executed or enslaved, while those who converted often did so with a sword pressed against their necks. But the knights weren't just mere brutes. They built fortresses wherever they marched, each one a symbol of permanent conquest. Wooden stockades soon gave way to stone, the most famous being Marienwerder and later Marienburg, the beating heart of their rising state. Monks became masons, and crusaders became landlords. In the frozen wilderness, the Teutonic Knights found something the Holy Land had never offered them: permanence. They were no longer just guests in a foreign desert, but the undisputed masters of their own domain. The Baltic frontier became their new Jerusalem, and the cross now flew over fields that had never even known it before. The Northern Crusade had officially begun. When the Teutonic Knights marched into Prussia, they didn't come as visitors. They came as architects of a new world. Between 1230 and 1280, they transformed the wild lands of the Baltic into a fortress state built on both faith and fear. Their white mantles moved like ghosts through the forests of birch and pine, their processions echoing with hymns that promised salvation, but delivered mostly submission. At first, the Prussians resisted fiercely. They fought as they lived, in tribes bound by kinship and the sacred fires of their gods. They struck from the forests, burning Teutonic outposts and vanishing back into the snow. For a time, the knights underestimated them, dismissing them as mere savages. But those so-called savages knew the land far better than any crusader ever could. They used rivers, marshes, and the harsh weather as their weapons. Dozens of castles were taken and retaken, and entire Teutonic garrisons vanished overnight without a trace. But the knights had something the pagans did not: patience, superior logistics, and a seemingly endless supply of divine paperwork. Each defeat was quickly followed by a reinforcement ship from the west, filled with fresh soldiers, skilled masons, and zealous priests. Every campaign ended with new fortresses rising on the ruins of rebellion. By 1255, the Order's control had expanded north to the Baltic coast, where they founded Königsberg, the King's Mountain, named after King Ottokar II of Bohemia, one of their crusading allies. It wasn't just a fortress. It was a clear statement. The Germans had come to stay. The conquest was brutal even by medieval standards. Pagan leaders were publicly executed, their priests were drowned, and their shrines were torn down and replaced by churches. The Prussians who converted often did so under duress, baptized in rivers that still ran red from war. Yet, as the decades passed, resistance slowly dwindled. The knights built roads, farms, and trading posts, turning chaos into a kind of grim order. By the end of the century, Prussia was no longer pagan. It was a Christianized military colony, ruled by an order that answered neither to king nor to bishop. The Teutonic Knights had achieved something even the Templars never had: a sovereign state forged by the sword and sanctified by Rome. But in their relentless zeal for conquest, they had also unwittingly sown the seeds of future defiance. For while the pagans were slowly falling silent, their powerful neighbors, Poland and Lithuania, were beginning to take notice. Wherever the Teutonic Knights went, imposing castles inevitably followed. To them, a fortress was much more than just a military stronghold. It was theology made of stone. Each towering structure symbolized divine order rising triumphantly above pagan chaos. From the fertile banks of the Vistula River to the icy shores of the Baltic Sea, the order's skilled engineers carved out a completely new landscape of authority, faith, and fear. Their castles were true masterpieces of German efficiency. Clean lines, red brick, and a cold, imposing symmetry. They built not for aesthetic beauty, but for sheer permanence. The most famous of them all, Marienburg, the Castle of Mary, stood proudly as the order's capital, a colossal red brick fortress sprawling magnificently over the Nogat River. It was part monastery, part barracks, and part bureaucratic hive. Inside its formidable walls, knights prayed devoutly in chapels, drilled rigorously in the courtyards, and held important councils in echoing halls where every sound served as a constant reminder of discipline. The construction of these fortresses was utterly relentless. Each campaign concluded not just with a hard-won battle, but also with a newly laid foundation. In conquered territories, crude wooden forts quickly gave way to impressive stone keeps. Thriving villages sprouted up beneath their walls, providing homes for settlers from Germany and Poland, skilled craftsmen and merchants who eagerly followed the order's expansion. Every single castle was a bold statement. God is here and he speaks German. But these impressive bastions of piety also concealed some deep contradictions. Within their seemingly impregnable walls lived men who were sworn to absolute purity, yet they were surrounded by undeniable luxury. Their refectories overflowed with the finest cuts of meat and expensive imported wine, and their treasuries bulged with tribute collected from the converted villages. The knights liked to call themselves monks of war, but their daily lives often more closely resembled those of wealthy feudal lords. Still, the castles worked effectively, both militarily and psychologically. The pagans saw them as practically invincible, while the Christians viewed them as solid proof that unwavering faith could indeed be built with mortar and stone. From Marienwerder to Königsberg, and from Thorn to Ragnit, a vast network of imposing strongholds spread out like a dark chain of black crosses across the northern landscape. They controlled not only the land itself, but also the very minds of everyone who lived beneath their long shadow. And yet, beneath all that carefully constructed piety, dangerous ambition began to stir. The order had initially started out as humble servants of God, healers, protectors, and guides. But now they were powerful rulers, wealthy landlords, and ruthless tax collectors. They were slowly becoming exactly what they had once despised: an empire cloaked in a deceptive veneer of holiness. The fine line between genuine crusade and outright colonization began to blur, and for the very first time, the Teutonic Knights started to look less like devoted warriors of Christ and more like heavily armed kings in shining armor. By the mid-13th century, the Teutonic Knights had finally found their true theater of war, not in the dusty deserts of Jerusalem, but in the snow-covered forests of the Baltic. What had begun as a simple conquest of Prussia gradually expanded into a full-blown holy war, known as the Northern Crusades. With official papal approval firmly in hand, the order now marched relentlessly against every tribe that dared to cling to the old gods. Livonians, Samogitians, Curonians, entire peoples suddenly became enemies of Christ overnight. Each campaign followed a grimly predictable rhythm. The knights would formally announce a crusade, gather eager volunteers from across Europe, and then descend upon the pagan lands in seemingly endless waves of heavily armored piety. Monks would bless their swords, priests would promise absolution, and the ominous black cross would gleam in the sun like a divine seal of permission. Villages that resisted were mercilessly burned to the ground, and any survivors were forcibly baptized amidst the choking smoke. Conversions came with uplifting sermons, and the occasional sword point for added emphasis. But not all crusades went exactly as planned. The Lithuanians proved to be incredibly stubborn, fierce, and cunning adversaries. They were the last great pagan power remaining in Europe, skilled horsemen who could seemingly vanish into the dense forests and strike without any warning. For every fortress that the Teutonic Knights successfully built, the Lithuanians managed to burn at least two. Campaign after bloody campaign, the frontier continued to bleed. The order piously called it holy war, but the Lithuanians simply called it survival. Still, the knights were nothing if not patient. They founded the inimitable Livers, a private society devoted to pleasure and excess. Every night was a feast of laughter, music, and wine that seemed to never run dry. They would roam the streets of Alexandria in disguise, playing pranks on unsuspecting citizens. The general who had once commanded legions now tossed fish into market stalls with his queen, delighted by the chaos. But the laughter masked a sharper truth. Behind every flirtation was a treaty. Behind every kiss, a calculation. Cleopatra needed Antony to secure her throne and her son Caesarion's future. The boy she claimed was Julius Caesar's heir. Antony, in turn, needed Egypt's gold to fund his armies and cement his authority in the East. Together, they became a political machine disguised as a love story. Back in Rome, the Senate seethed. Rumors of Antony's debauchery spread like wildfire. Stories claimed he'd abandoned Roman virtue to live as Cleopatra's puppet, a man bewitched by a foreign queen. The image of him wearing Egyptian robes, drinking from golden cups, and calling himself a god shocked the Romans to their core. Yet in Alexandria, none of that mattered. For a fleeting moment, they ruled the world as lovers and sovereigns, two stars burning too brightly to last. But even stars, no matter how brilliant, eventually collapse under their own gravity. While Antony and Cleopatra reveled in the splendor of Alexandria, Rome was simmering with outrage. The once great general who had stood beside Julius Caesar was now painted as a man enslaved by luxury and lust, the plaything of an Eastern temptress, and no one exploited that image better than Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and Antony's political rival. Octavian understood propaganda like a modern strategist understands media. He didn't need to defeat Antony on the battlefield, not yet. He would destroy him in the minds of the Roman people first. Pamphlets, speeches, and whispered rumors turned Antony into the villain of a national drama. They didn't necessarily need to win every single battle. They just needed to outlast their enemy's will to resist. Their well-defended network of castles, their highly disciplined ranks, and their seemingly endless supply of crusading volunteers gave them a significant edge. In time, they managed to subdue most of Livonia and Estonia, absorbing the remnants of other smaller crusader groups like the Sword Brothers. The Baltic frontier became a permanent war zone, a bleak and unforgiving place where faith, fire, and frost brutally collided. By the 14th century, the Teutonic Order's banner stretched proudly across the entire northern coast, from Danzig all the way to Narva. They ruled as both priests and princes, their authority firmly backed by the Pope in Rome, and ruthlessly enforced by cold steel. To the Pope, they were valiant defenders of Christendom. But to the conquered peoples, they were nothing short of the apocalypse in shining armor. The Northern Crusades had made them incredibly rich and powerful, far beyond their humble founding dreams. But the more they conquered, the further they drifted away from the original humility of those hospital tents in Acre. The Black Cross still stood proudly for faith, but it also cast a long, ominous shadow over the whole of Europe. By the early 14th century, the Teutonic Order had become far more than just a brotherhood of knights. It had evolved into a fully functioning state, a theocracy with armor. From their colossal headquarters at Marienburg, the Grand Master ruled over vast territories that stretched from the Vistula River all the way to the Gulf of Finland. This was no longer just a simple kingdom of nobles, but a meticulously organized machine of faith and discipline. Every castle served as a strategic command center, and every village was a meticulously placed cog in the vast divine engine. The order's government was structured much like a monastery, but with swords. He was accused of dressing as an Egyptian, calling himself the new Dionysus, and bowing to Cleopatra as if she were a goddess. To Rome, that wasn't romance. It was treason wrapped in perfume. Meanwhile, Cleopatra and Antony continued to blur the line between passion and politics. Together, they envisioned an empire uniting both East and West, a revival of Alexander's dream. Cleopatra sought to restore Egypt's glory. Antony wanted to carve out his own dynasty beyond Rome's reach. To cement this alliance, Antony publicly recognized Cleopatra's children, including Caesarion, allegedly the son of Julius Caesar, as rulers of the Eastern territories. The gesture infuriated Octavian. In Roman eyes, Antony had not only betrayed his country but insulted Caesar's legacy by elevating a foreign heir over him. The rift widened when Antony's Roman wife, Octavian's sister, Octavia, tried to reconcile the two men. Antony refused her, sending her back humiliated. It was a fatal mistake. Octavian now had both personal and political ammunition. He spread the story that Cleopatra had bewitched Antony, that she used dark magic to enslave his will. To the Roman masses, this was irresistible gossip. In truth, Antony wasn't bewitched. He was simply blind to how deeply the tide had turned. While he and Cleopatra dined under silver ceilings, Rome was being prepared for holy war, not against Parthia or any foreign enemy, but against its own general. Love, once their greatest strength, was now Octavian's weapon, and with every whisper, Antony's honor sank further into the sands of Egypt. In 34 BCE, Antony and Cleopatra staged one of the most audacious political spectacles of the ancient world, the donations of Alexandria. It was meant to dazzle Egypt and the East. Instead, it gave Octavian the perfect script for treason. The event took place in the great gymnasium of Alexandria, a grand hall filled with gold, incense, and cheering crowds. The Grand Master served as both emperor and abbot, flanked by a council of high-ranking knights who governed individual regions known as bailiwicks. Below them were the compters, the commanders who managed individual fortresses, collecting taxes, training troops, and relentlessly enforcing the order's rigid rules. Even local peasants were expected to live under a kind of constant holy surveillance, their labor seen as direct service to God's mighty army. Economically, the order was virtually unmatched. Their highly disciplined bureaucracy made them the most efficient landlords anywhere in Northern Europe. Grain, valuable amber, and prized furs flowed steadily through their bustling ports, quickly filling their coffers and easily financing their endless wars. The powerful Hanseatic merchants of Lübeck and Danzig flocked to their burgeoning trade hubs, enriching the order even further. The monks might have piously vowed poverty, but the Teutonic Knights were quite busy building vast cathedrals of wealth. Religiously, they presented themselves as shining paragons of Christian virtue. Mandatory morning prayers, silent meals, and daily masses were strictly enforced. But beneath that carefully polished surface, temptation often simmered. Some knights secretly broke their sacred vows, keeping mistresses hidden away or drinking heavily in their isolated castles. Others grew increasingly obsessed with power, using the order's considerable authority to settle petty personal vendettas. The carefully maintained purity that they so loudly preached was quickly becoming nothing more than an elaborate illusion, polished to a high shine for papal approval. Politically, the order behaved less like humble crusaders and more like an ambitious empire. They founded new towns, ruthlessly imposed German law, and eagerly encouraged settlers to colonize the conquered lands of the native tribes. Paganism had been effectively crushed, and now came Germanization. Antony and Cleopatra sat on twin thrones, dressed as living gods. He is Dionysus, she is Isis. Before them stood their children, each draped in royal robes. What followed was less a ceremony and more a declaration. Antony divided the Eastern Empire among Cleopatra and her heirs. Caesarion was proclaimed King of Kings, rightful son of Julius Caesar. The younger children, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, were crowned rulers of vast territories stretching from Armenia to Cyrene. To the Alexandrians, it was divine theater, the rebirth of empire. To Rome, it was betrayal. A Roman general had given away provinces that belonged to the Republic, all to please a foreign queen. The Senate was horrified. Octavian's allies called Antony a traitor, accusing him of building a rival empire centered in Egypt. Antony, perhaps drunk on the pageantry, underestimated how this looked from afar. To him, the donations were diplomacy, a way to stabilize the East under loyal rulers. To Cleopatra, it was triumph. For the first time in generations, Egypt stood as the beating heart of a new world order. Together, they believed they could challenge Rome itself. But Octavian saw opportunity. He collected Antony's will, possibly stolen from the Vestal Virgin's temple, and read it aloud to the Senate. In it, Antony supposedly wished to be buried beside Cleopatra in Alexandria, not in Rome. Whether genuine or forged hardly mattered. The reaction was outrage. The Republic's patience snapped. From that moment, the affair was no longer a scandal. It was a war. Rome would not forgive a general who called himself a god beside a queen who called herself divine. Cleopatra had dreamed of an empire reborn. Antony dreamed of freedom from Rome's chains. Instead, their union had painted a single target on both their crowns. Love and politics had become indistinguishable, and now both would lead them to ruin. By 32 BCE, Rome was done whispering. Well-paved roads, towering churches, and bustling markets replaced the sacred groves of old. To outside observers, the Teutonic state looked practically invincible, a seemingly perfect blend of unwavering faith and iron discipline. But to those on the inside, serious cracks were starting to form. The knights had successfully conquered the world that they had so desperately wanted, and now they had to figure out how to rule it effectively. And ruling effectively required something that they had never learned on the bloody battlefield: restraint. Power inevitably invites enemies, and by the mid-14th century, the Teutonic Order had acquired more than it could possibly handle. Their brutal expansion into the Baltic region had earned them very few genuine friends and a vast collection of deeply held grudges. Chief among their growing list of rivals were two rising Christian powers, Poland and Lithuania, who through a combination of shrewd diplomacy and unwavering faith, began to seriously challenge the Order's perceived divine monopoly. Lithuania, once so proudly pagan, shocked the entire Christian world in 1386 when its Grand Duke Jogaila converted to Christianity and married Queen Jadwiga of Poland, thus creating the powerful Polish-Lithuanian Union. It was a true masterstroke of clever politics. Almost overnight, the Teutonic Knights lost their very favorite excuse for waging war. The Lithuanians were suddenly no longer heathens who needed to be forcibly baptized by the point of a sword. They were now Christians and fellow Europeans, and were expected to maintain peace. But peace was the absolute last thing that the Teutonic Order actually wanted. The knights stubbornly refused to accept the validity of the conversion, dismissing it as nothing more than a false baptism, and accusing Jogaila of merely pretending to be a Christian in order to avoid holy punishment. It was convenient theology, and a perfectly good pretext for their continued conquest. The Senate declared war not on Antony directly but on Cleopatra. It was a clever move by Octavian. Framing the conflict as a holy crusade against a foreign queen made Antony's Roman supporters look like traitors and allowed Octavian to appear as the defender of Roman virtue. The love story of Antony and Cleopatra had become the justification for an empire-wide war. Antony's forces rallied in the east. He commanded vast legions and an impressive fleet, bolstered by Cleopatra's Egyptian navy and endless treasure. Together, they prepared for confrontation on the Aegean coast. In Alexandria, Cleopatra oversaw the arming of ships while priests blessed the war banners. Antony, meanwhile, descended into a grim mixture of determination and denial. He knew Octavian's propaganda had poisoned Rome against him, but he believed victory could silence it. Octavian, however, was no soldier in shining armor. He was a strategist of reputation. His general, Marcus Agrippa, took the lead in the field, seizing key ports and cutting off Antony's supply lines. The propaganda machine continued its assault. Rome was flooded with images of Cleopatra as a seductive sorceress, riding Antony like a puppet. Even the gods, it seemed, had turned their favor toward Octavian. Antony and Cleopatra's forces finally assembled at Actium on the western coast of Greece. It was a poor choice. Narrow waters, unpredictable winds, and a fleet burdened with oversized Egyptian galleys. Many of Antony's officers advised retreat to Egypt, but pride chained him to the fight. To abandon now would mean conceding not just the war but his legend. As the armies faced each other across the Ionian Sea, tension gripped both camps. Cleopatra walked among her soldiers, dressed in armor beneath her royal cloak, urging courage. Antony promised victory and revenge. But beneath their speeches, fear rippled. Their armies were vast, but their unity fragile. Mercenaries fought for pay, not loyalty, and supplies were running thin. They launched repeated invasions into Lithuanian territory, claiming divine justification while burning villages and enslaving countless peasants. For years, the contested borderlands became a bloody battlefield. The knights' shining armor and strict military formations clashed violently with the swift cavalry of the Lithuanians and Poles. Crusading volunteers from Germany, France, and even England joined the order seeking holy adventure, while Lithuanian nobles bravely rallied under the defiant black and red banner of their homeland. The mounting tension eventually culminated in one of the most significant medieval battles ever fought, the Battle of Grunwald, also known as the Battle of Tannenberg. In 1410, the Teutonic Knights, led by their Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen, confidently marched out, fully expecting a swift and decisive victory. They faced a combined Polish-Lithuanian army led by Jogaila and Vytautas the Great. The knights, highly disciplined and filled with pride, formed their shining ranks on the open field and were swiftly and utterly annihilated. By the end of that long and bloody day, the Order's once fearsome army lay completely shattered. Ulrich himself was slain, his pristine white mantle trampled in the mud. It was undeniably the beginning of the end. Although the Order managed to survive politically, its long-held myth of invincibility had been irrevocably destroyed. Grunwald was much more than just a simple military defeat. It was a total and humiliating rout. For the very first time, the seemingly unbreakable Black Cross had been broken, not by pagan hordes but by fellow Christians. And within that bitter irony lay the cruelest twist of all. The very order that had once claimed to defend all of Christendom had finally been undone by it. After the catastrophic defeat at Grunwald in 1410, the Teutonic Order never truly recovered. The final battle was approaching, and neither love nor gold could delay it. The stage was set for a confrontation that would decide not only who ruled Rome but whether the world would remember Antony and Cleopatra as conquerors or as the lovers who destroyed themselves. On the morning of September 2nd, 31 BCE, the Ionian Sea shimmered under a pitiless sun. Across the waters near Actium, two worlds stared each other down. On one side stood Octavian's disciplined legions and the brilliant Admiral Agrippa. On the other, the glittering but uneasy alliance of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Their fleets anchored in a crescent formation, heavy with Egyptian treasure, ambition, and fate. Antony's ships were magnificent but unwieldy, massive galleys armed like floating fortresses. Cleopatra's fleet, lighter and faster, lingered near the rear, her royal standard fluttering over a golden vessel. On land, thousands of soldiers waited for the signal that would decide the future of the Mediterranean. As the battle began, the sea filled with the roar of rams and the thunder of catapults. Smoke swallowed the horizon. Agrippa's smaller, more agile ships darted through the chaos, striking the cumbersome Egyptian vessels and vanishing before they could retaliate. Antony's line began to falter. Confusion spread. The wind turned. Sails tangled. Orders clashed. Then came the moment that would haunt history. Cleopatra's fleet suddenly broke formation and turned south, retreating toward the open sea. Whether this was a planned maneuver or panic, no one truly knows. Seeing her royal banner vanish into the horizon, Antony made his fatal choice. He abandoned command, boarded a smaller ship, and chased after her. His men watched in disbelief as their commander, the conqueror of Parthia, the hero of Rome, sailed away for love. Without their leader, Antony's fleet collapsed. Agrippa's forces closed in, burning and boarding the remaining ships. They limped back to their once imposing fortresses, still radiating pride, but feeling undeniably hollow, their aura of divine invincibility shattered into a million pieces. The once mighty monastic empire slowly began to crumble, not in a single swift blow, but slowly, like a fortress left to rot quietly from within. The knights still wore their white cloaks and dutifully prayed their daily prayers, but their once unwavering confidence had turned brittle and fragile. The Baltic wind that had once carried their triumphant hymns now carried only whispers of failure. The decades that followed were filled with uneasy truces, mounting debts, and frequent rebellions. The Order's treasury, once overflowing with tribute and trade, slowly bled dry from expensive war reparations and the gradual loss of crucial lands. Their subjects, German settlers, native Prussians, and Polish converts, grew increasingly restless under their heavy-handed rule. The carefully cultivated aura of holiness that had once justified the Order's harsh authority was now long gone, replaced by simmering resentment and backbreaking taxation. The final, decisive blow came from within their own ranks. In 1525, Grand Master Albert of Brandenburg embraced the rising winds of the Protestant Reformation and did the unthinkable. He openly abandoned his sacred vows, secularized all of the Order's territories, and declared himself Duke of Prussia under Polish suzerainty. The Teutonic Order, once a fearsome warrior brotherhood bound by oaths of absolute purity and obedience, had simply become a duchy, its iconic black cross now nothing more than a fading heraldic memory. The sacred had been coldly replaced by the political, and the warrior monks had quietly transformed into ordinary bureaucrats. Yet, despite its ignominious fall, the lingering shadow of the Teutonic Order somehow remained. The once mighty armada was reduced to smoke and splintered wood. Antony caught up to Cleopatra's fleeing flagship hours later. The two reportedly sat in silence as the sea behind them turned black with fire. In that moment, they both understood what they had done. Not just lost a battle, but surrendered an empire. Back in Rome, Octavian declared victory. He presented the war as divine justice, reason defeating decadence, virtue triumphing over corruption. But in truth, it was something far more human, ambition defeating love. The Battle of Actium was not merely a clash of fleets. It was the end of an age and the beginning of a legend. The defeat at Actium was the beginning of the end. Antony and Cleopatra fled across the Mediterranean, not as conquerors but as fugitives of their own empire. When they returned to Alexandria, the city greeted them not with cheers but with dread. The once golden couple had become symbols of ruin. Their fleet was gone. Their allies had deserted them, and Octavian was marching east with an army that would not stop until Egypt bowed. Cleopatra retreated into her palace, surrounding herself with treasures and loyal guards, as if walls of gold could delay reality. She began preparing her mausoleum, not as a monument to vanity but as a final refuge. Antony, meanwhile, sank into despair. The soldier who had once ruled half the known world now spent his days drinking and brooding among statues of gods that no longer listened. In 30 BCE, Octavian's legions reached Alexandria. His propaganda had done its work. Many of Antony's officers defected before the fighting even began. In a last act of defiance, Antony led his remaining troops in a doomed counterattack near the city gates. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, his army disintegrated. The war was over before it began. Rumor soon reached Antony that Cleopatra was dead, that she had taken her own life to avoid capture. Shattered, he fell upon his sword. The blade did not kill him immediately. Their imposing castles Marienburg, Königsberg, Thorn still stood as silent witnesses to a bygone era of brutal conquest and unwavering faith. Remained standing, red brick monuments to discipline and dominion. Their statecraft and organization laid the groundwork for Prussia's later rise, a new kind of empire, one forged not in the name of God, but in the name of efficiency and power. The very spirit that had once driven the Teutonic Crusades would centuries later echo in the militarism of the Prussian kings. In the end, the Teutonic Knights were both saints and sinners, builders and destroyers. They brought literacy, law, and trade to the Baltic, but also bloodshed, slavery, and forced conversion. Their black cross became a paradox, a symbol of faith corrupted by ambition. When their last true knights died, the order didn't vanish. It simply changed costume. The prayer had ended, but the echo of the crusade still haunted Europe, a reminder that even holy men given too much power can become what they once swore to fight. The year was 41 BCE, and the Roman world was bleeding from within. Julius Caesar was dead. The Republic was dying, and three men now ruled what remained: Octavian in Rome, Lepidus in Africa, and Mark Antony in the East. Of the three, Antony was the most brilliant soldier and the most dangerously human. He was impulsive, charming, and reckless, a man who could conquer nations but not his own desires. It was this flaw, or perhaps this gift, that led him straight into the orbit of Cleopatra VII, Queen of Egypt. Their first meeting took place in the city of Tarsus on the southern coast of modern-day Turkey. Antony had summoned Cleopatra to answer accusations that she had aided his enemies. Most rulers would have arrived humbled, veiled, and afraid. But Cleopatra was not most rulers. She turned a summons into a spectacle. Mortally wounded, he ordered his servants to carry him to her tomb. When the doors opened, Cleopatra was alive, pale, weeping, and furious at the lie that had doomed him. As he bled out in her arms, Antony gasped his final words, urging her to make peace with Octavian. Then the great general, the man who had conquered empires and lost everything for love, died beside the woman who had undone him. Octavian entered Alexandria days later. Cleopatra received him dressed in her finest regalia, her composure flawless even in defeat. She tried once more to charm Rome's new master, but Octavian was made of colder stone. He wanted her alive as a trophy for his triumph in Rome. Cleopatra understood the humiliation that awaited her. She would not survive it. As Octavian secured Egypt for Rome, the queen prepared for her final act. The stage was set for one of history's most haunting farewells. Cleopatra had ruled for 21 years, outwitted generals, seduced emperors, and defied the most powerful empire on earth. But now, in the summer of 30 BCE, her empire was gone. Octavian's soldiers patrolled the streets of Alexandria. Her ships lay burned in the harbor, and her lover's body had already been buried with Roman honors. All that remained was her pride, and she guarded that more fiercely than any throne. Octavian, cold and deliberate, wanted her alive. In Rome, her capture would be his ultimate victory, a living symbol of Egypt's fall, paraded through the streets in chains. But Cleopatra understood spectacle better than anyone. She would not let her life end as another man's triumph. If she could not rule as a goddess, she would die as one. Confined to her mausoleum, she began to prepare. She bathed, dined, and dressed as though for a coronation, not an execution. Her servants adorned her in royal gold, braided her hair, and perfumed her hands. In her final hours, she received Octavian's envoys with calm defiance. According to legend, she sailed up the Cydnus River in a barge plated with gold, its purple sails billowing under a perfumed breeze. The air shimmered with incense. Cleopatra herself reclined beneath a canopy, dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, while attendants fanned her with peacock feathers. Musicians played, dancers moved in rhythm, and the curious citizens of Tarsus crowded the banks to witness what felt less like a royal audience and more like a myth unfolding in real time. Antony, who had faced armies and triumphed in countless wars, was unprepared. He expected a nervous queen seeking forgiveness. Instead, he found a woman who commanded the stage better than any general commanded an army. Cleopatra knew the power of presentation, that in a world ruled by men, appearance could be its own kind of weapon. When she finally met Antony, she spoke with confidence and wit, blending flattery with challenge. She treated him not as a conqueror but as an equal, or perhaps as prey. By the time the banquet ended, Antony was captivated. Her intellect matched his ambition. Her charm softened his pride. That evening in Tarsus was no mere diplomatic encounter. It was the opening act of one of history's most intoxicating and destructive romances. A union born not of love alone, but of calculation, desire, and the unstoppable magnetism between power and beauty. Cleopatra had conquered Antony long before she touched his hand. Her weapon wasn't beauty alone. It was spectacle. In Egypt, power was theater, and Cleopatra was its leading performer. So when she invited Antony to a banquet aboard her gilded barge, she wasn't simply entertaining him. She was staging a conquest. The night was designed to overwhelm the senses. The decks glowed with lanterns reflecting off the Nile. Musicians played soft flutes in the distance, and servants moved like shadows carrying trays of jeweled cups and silver platters. She assured them she had no intention of harming herself, even as her eyes lingered on a small woven basket that had been brought to her chambers, disguised as a gift of figs. When Octavian's guards returned, they found her lifeless, lying upon a golden couch in her imperial robes. Two of her attendants, Iris and Charmian, were dead beside her. A faint pair of puncture marks showed on Cleopatra's arm. The serpent, the sacred ASP, had delivered its fatal kiss. News of her death spread like wildfire. Octavian was furious. She had denied him his victory, yet even he could not help but admire her final performance. Cleopatra had robbed Rome of its spectacle and secured her legacy in one elegant gesture. She was buried beside Antony, just as she had wished, united in death as in defiance. With their deaths, Egypt's independence ended. Octavian became Augustus, Rome's first emperor, and the age of republics gave way to empire. But the legend of Antony and Cleopatra refused to die. For centuries, poets, painters, and playwrights would return to their story. Two lovers who turned politics into passion and passion into myth. Their empire crumbled, but their names became immortal. Antony, dressed in Roman armor still dusty from campaign, found himself in a world where time seemed to melt away. Cleopatra reclined beside him in silk-dyed Tyrian purple, a color so costly it was reserved for gods and emperors. Every gesture, every word was measured. When she laughed, it wasn't just charming, it was strategy. The meal itself was legendary. According to later accounts, Cleopatra hosted 12 banquets, each one more extravagant than the last. At one, she wagered Antony that she could spend 10 million sesterces on a single meal, and won by dissolving one of her priceless pearls in vinegar and drinking it. Whether true or exaggerated, the message was unmistakable. While Rome worshipped discipline, Egypt worshipped magnificence. Cleopatra wasn't just wealthy, she was wealth. For Antony, it was irresistible. Egypt offered everything Rome had taken from him: joy, indulgence, and freedom from the politics that had consumed his life. He was no longer one of three rulers of a fractured empire. In Alexandria, he was a king beside a queen, and Cleopatra knew precisely how to make him feel that way. But beneath the glitter and music, this was more than seduction. Both needed something from the other. Cleopatra sought protection. Egypt's independence was always just one Roman ambition away from extinction. Antony, meanwhile, needed money and ships for his coming campaign against the Parthians. Each saw in the other not only desire but opportunity. As the banquet ended, the line between pleasure and politics dissolved completely. Antony was no longer the interrogator, and Cleopatra no longer the accused. They were now partners in ambition and soon in something far more dangerous. In the candlelight of that Egyptian night, empire and emotion began to blur. By the time Antony followed Cleopatra to Alexandria, their bond had become the most talked-about scandal in the ancient world. What began as an affair of diplomacy had transformed into a partnership of passion and politics, and it was impossible to tell which was the more dangerous. In the marble palaces of Alexandria, Antony found a life Rome could never give him: luxury without limits, love without restraint, and power that felt divine. Cleopatra, however, was not lost in romance. She was calculating, as any ruler surrounded by Roman ambition had to be. She knew Antony's weaknesses: pride, vanity, and a thirst for adoration, and she fed them skillfully. In Egypt, he wasn't the weary general battling the Senate's whispers. He was Dionysus, reborn, god of wine and victory. Cleopatra encouraged the illusion because it served them both. Their court became legendary, a world of silk and intoxication.